Yeah, I mostly am just interested in responding to your thoughts. Like I have a bunch of notes I wrote on the video, but nothing that's like super needing to get out, if that makes sense. I
Okay.
wish I wish I had something more alive, but I'm sure if you bring stuff up, it'll generate stuff for me too.
Yeah. Um, I had some very just rough, like basically marker topics that they touched on that I provoked something in me, but I didn't write down any sort of explicit notes. I listened to it a second time when I was driving,
Oh,
and
nice.
I like wanted to take notes, but I was driving, and so it was like not the right place for that.
Yeah,
Um,
sometimes I still manage. Probably not a good idea.
I
Sometimes with a
did. I
voice.
wrote down a few things, even though I was driving. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this. I think. Well, let's see. Where do I want to start? Um, well, they touched. Okay, so the first thing I have here is the topic of evil, which they touched on a little bit, and that's been something that I've kind of been thinking a bit about, and it touches on the um kind of this discussion between Pageau and Vervaeke and Vanderklay around like demon angels and demons and um what yeah, I mean like the and the way that this is relevant for me is like basically when it comes to people in my life, like my own family, who's like coming from like a Protestant Christian. A lot of them are coming from like a more charismatic
Mm,
um, background, and I'm finding like oh, I'm almost to the point where I can actually like meet them where they're at, and like, and I'm trying to like piece that together. So I guess the biggest thing that Pageau actually touched on because it seems like it feels like Peterson has a almost like a more dualistic notion of good and evil.
oh yeah, for sure. He always has.
And Pageau kind of came back with that like basically he was pushing back like the danger of that is you get stuck into like this these polar opposites of good and evil. And it seemed like he and Vervaeke are more in agreement that like there's not a symmetric relationship between the two, that that evil is um, something that's parasitic on the good,
Yes.
and no one. The interesting thing, the point of contention was like, what was it? Is like no one willingly does evil; they're always serving some sort of good. And I don't know if I like. I almost want to try to steelman Peterson on that. Like he had his example was who was Foucault raping boys in graveyards, which it's like I don't know. I'm curious to hear your like if you were to steelman Peterson's view that like okay, Foucault in that context is willingly doing evil. Like, how would you do that?
Yeah, Olivia and I had a great debate on this. And I feel like I largely brought her over to my perspective, which is also Vervaeke and Pageau's. So it'll be good practice for me to steelman Peterson, who I largely disagree with on this point. Um, so, I mean, I think in some sense, he is pointing out the fact that people can be aware that they're doing something wrong or evil and still choose to do it, which is fine. I would just say now I'm already going past the steel manning. I would just qualify it by saying that um, if they had perfect knowledge, which is obviously impossible, then that would include, like a complete empathic or empathetic knowledge of the person they're harming, and therefore, in some sense, they would have their perspective and therefore wouldn't do it. But because they have a limited knowledge, and yet they still have enough knowledge to know what they're doing is wrong in some sense, they can still do it because uh, their knowledge is finite. Like it especially, I think, comes up into an issue when people have too much of a purely propositional understanding of knowledge, and then they'll say, well, they have the sufficient knowledge, and yet they're choosing to do evil, but they may not have, the perspectival, empathetic knowledge. If that makes sense. That's kind of how I explained it to Olivia.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I know Vervaeke has also talked about this before in discussions around Kierkegaard and Augustine, kind of also on Peterson's side of like choosing to do evil, even though I think maybe it was the late Augustine, because the earlier Augustine definitely had, like, he came up, I think, with the privation notion of evil, which is kind of central for most of Orthodox Christianity, even though you get some more dualistic Gnostic versions at various points. But because he used to be a Manichaean, and I have kind of my own ideas on how his Manichaeanism later infected his proto-Calvinism at the end of Augustine's life. But he uh, and Kierkegaard, Vervaeke was saying, make the argument that you can knowingly do evil, whereas Vervaeke was taking up, Socrates saying that no one willingly does evil, that it's always partially based off ignorance, because they're kind of assuming they know themselves in a sort of their belief overstepping the bounds of their knowledge or rationality, which he says Socrates is, always uh, pointing out when people do that. I forget the language John uses, but you know what I'm talking about. In that sense, Kierkegaard and Augustine would be overstepping their own rationality and assuming they fully know themselves and are fully choosing to do evil when they're still ignorant in some sense.
Right. Right. Okay. So evil. So I'm trying to this notion of parasitism, like evil being parasitic on the good. Um, I I'm trying to integrate that into this idea of because yeah, okay. So evil being parasitic on the good. What does that mean exactly in terms of because I think I understand that in terms of like this idea of demonic possession. Like I can be possessed by a spirit, so to speak, that's um a parasite on my own agency, and some sort of addiction or something like an
Yeah,
addiction would be an example of that. And the object of the addiction, the thing that I'm addicted to, is a good, but it's not in its proper place or something
yeah,
like that. And so then that is because it's not in its proper place, it's somehow parasitic on the larger whole or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Why is that?
Like it relates to foolishness also when John talks about it as it's not. Yeah, I guess it would be good to distinguish between um, ignorance per se and then foolishness, where you know at least propositionally what is good, but you don't have like the willpower in some sense because you haven't trained, um, using Plato's three part metaphor. You haven't trained the lion to guard against the monster, which is like the addictive, uh, the passions, as Pageau would say, and so they, sort of take over, and it becomes it's parasitic in the sense that, like, good is substantial and evil is privation or distortion in the classical, in Christian ontology, and therefore it has no substance in and of itself, but it's like the things in the world that are good in themselves, being in improper relationship uh, to one another, and like yeah, like you said, outside their proper context, or breaking down or breaking apart, um, and then someone acting evilly would be contributing to that breakdown, um, or yeah, things not being in their proper place. But I guess that doesn't really answer how the parasitic metaphor. Well, it sort of does. If a parasite is like purely feeding off of its host, so the good, and as they touch on later, which is not identical with, but what's the word? Translatable to, that wasn't Aquinas's language, but translatable to the true and the beautiful as well. Those are substantial and also translatable with being as such. And then evil is like a distortion or privation or um, yeah, misuse of those, as they should be manifesting in their proper logos and finite beings.
So the parasitic nature of evil is a consequence of a good that's out of its proper place in relationship to other goods or something like that.
Yeah, since there's always a hierarchy of goods,
Right.
and I think
So then
Pageau,
that good becomes parasitic because it's out
um,
of place.
is it good? Well, yeah, I suppose
And
you
so
could say that.
it stops being good because it's out of yeah, I'm just trying to work out what is the yeah, how does the parasitism factor into this?
Well, the question of whether the improperly placed good ceases being good at all is something I hadn't really thought of. Normally, I guess I think of it as like it's out of balance, and so you could say, um, uh, someone stealing um, food when they already are like sufficiently um, healthy enough, but they just don't want to pay for it when there's like starving people around. The nutrition they're getting from the food is still good, but because the action is depriving others of it when they need it more, it's like it's yeah, it's like an inverted hierarchy in some sense because of the context. So even if it is still good, like I would be fine with saying it's still good in isolation, but since nothing exists in isolation, it becomes corrupted in some sense, so that the overall action is evil and the effects are evil, even if one aspect, if you isolate it, like the fed person being filled with nutrition from the stolen food is in and of itself good. It's like a trivial good that isn't worth it because the overall effect is, the net effect is evil.
So then trying to put that together with like a person who does evil is someone who has um well I like is is under some sort of demonic possession if you want to use that language or someone who's suffering from an addiction or something like that to some degree like it
Yeah,
seems that's which to varying degrees we all do
yeah,
in
and I
some
think it's like mutually reinforced by um ignorance in the more um general sense, uh or even like the perspectival ignorance of the other, which agape tries can
mm,
ameliorate. And I think the language of tying together uh possession or um like unclean spirits or demonic possession with addiction, and like say just the seven deadly sins when people are in the grips of something like gluttony, is very helpful for, like you're saying before, uh having intelligibility between people who grew up in a more
right,
literalist fundamentalist vein.
right. No, I know these conversations about like egregores and angels and demons and all of that have been super helpful for affording that possibility.
Yeah,
Um,
Pageau has
I
been
know
great
I
on that.
remember you saying like those were you've been kind of because I expressed that I was really focused like those are the conversations I'm kind of most focused on right now is between like Paul Vanderklay and Pageau and Vervaeke, and you seemed like you were in a similar
Yeah,
you related to that.
yeah, especially with Vervaeke. And so yeah, this was a great talk overall. It was almost like Pageau. It was mostly between Peterson and Vervaeke, and I hadn't listened to Peterson in a while. Ever since he went with the Daily Wire, I was kind of a little skeptical, but it felt to me almost like it was his old self back. So maybe he is like this more often now. I don't know. I haven't listened to him in years actually, but I forgot how endearing he could be. It almost felt like Pageau was kind of on the sidelines, and then I was really excited when Pageau said at several points like he's closer to Vervaeke on like narrative
Yeah.
not being the whole. Um, yeah, I thought it was a great dynamic between the three of them, even though Pageau was almost like off to the side a little bit. It was still great.
Okay. Yeah, I want to get to the narrative stuff, but I wanted to.
So
Uh,
where would you land regarding the initial disagreement between Peterson and Pageau and Vervaeke on evil, like whether anyone can, willingly in the complete sense? I think you have to make it extreme. Like, can someone with with perfect knowledge do evil, even if that's impossible? It's just a hypothetical. I think.
well, it to me like the ontological status of evil is the important thing in answering that question. But I'm not sure exactly why, but that's
Mm,
like
well, yeah, I agree.
and to me like if if you're gonna if you're gonna suppose a fundamental duality between good and evil, then it's like, well, I don't know, reality is just fundamentally split, and
Yeah,
there's no like I
that's
just
precisely
that's
why.
not tenable for me.
Oh, I
Um,
agree, and that's precisely why like Christianity had to come up with the privation theory, I think, because otherwise they'd have to introduce some amount of evil into God if they're claiming God is like the source of, if they're going to hold the creation ex nihilo, basically. Whereas Peterson is kind of in a more Zoroastrian perspective in some sense. Same with Alexander Bard, where there's some degree of chaos from the beginning in some sense, because Peterson will often talk about that with the tohu bohu in the first chapter of Genesis and so on. He has a little bit more of like a demiurge concept of God as bringing order out of chaos, as opposed to being the source, including of that stuff, which is kind of a different conversation where process theology actually agrees with that model where they don't hold the creation ex nihilo, which in some sense makes the problem of evil easier, but that's like another discussion. I don't know if you want to go into that.
that's really interesting. I don't know really anything about Zoroastrianism.
Oh,
Uh,
it's just kind of infamous for, now Alexander Bard would dispute this, but for having a sharp ontological duality between
okay.
Ahura Mazda, the good god, and then I forget the other one, the evil god, as there from all time, which kind of was like a big turning point in the history of religions, which up until that point had been more pantheistic slash polytheistic, without a sharp dualism. And then Alexander Bard argues that was kind of part of the start of civilizations. Um, like that ontology was supported by and mutually reinforced, the first civilizations as opposed to like hunter gatherer tribes, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, okay. So um this because that sort of duality is not tenable for me. That says something about the nature of evil in that it's not fundamental. It can't be fundamental.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
agree. It's like a kind of distortion,
right.
but it's not an
And
illusion per se, because I think that's also a danger. But it's like yeah, it's like an improper um relation almost. Like a yeah.
Right. Well,
Because
and
if you
it's
have multiplicity, then that potential is there for improper relation.
the question comes up for me is like, is there evil prior to like I mean, I guess this is a big question in the Christian tradition that has various answers that I'm not well, knowledge. I don't have a lot of um I'm not knowledgeable in, but the question of where does evil show up? Like if you take an evolutionary perspective, then and trying to integrate that with a Christian perspective,
Mm,
it
right,
might seem
right.
like if evil shows up at the fall, then there really isn't evil until sort of the dawn of self-consciousness. And like Peterson would say, that's sort of that coincides with the fall. And so then that would suggest that that suggests something about like the ontology of evil if it doesn't show up until then. But there's something that doesn't quite feel right about that. But there does seem to be some sort of break, and that's been like at that stage in evolution. Uh, and that's been something I've been trying to piece out is like what exactly shifts there, and why is it that there's this sense that like there was something like a fall from paradise, there was something that like broke at that point in evolutionary history. Um, and yeah, and then what does that say about the nature of evil? I don't know. What do you think? How how deep does evil go? What do you think?
Yeah, I've been thinking more so about this specific question than anything the last month or two. And I mean, there's some debate even, within small O Orthodox Christianity about this, especially since evolution. And I think kind of a combined approach is best in some sense, where I guess for me, things like especially if you use the model of evil as parasitic, then things like actual parasites or cancer seem very difficult to affirm as like they have no relation whatsoever to evil, like not even analogically. So Whitehead, who's still kind of my favorite philosopher, does because he has a kind of pan experientialism, pan organicism, has a degree of freedom for all beings down to the fundamental particles, and therefore there is even though things largely will follow like the kind of um, superjective lure he calls it of God, because there's created freedom for novelty. There's always the potential for um, things to go otherwise, and for basically lesser goods to sorry for higher goods to be sacrificed for lesser goods, which is one of his definitions for evil. I think he also has quite a good description of evil, where he also says it's inherently self-destructive because it's parasitic. He doesn't use the word parasitic, I think, but it's basically the same model, that it can go along for a while because it's drawing on other modes of being, but similar to how cancer cells are self-destructive of the
Who
host.
is who is this
Oh,
that you're?
Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh, Whitehead. Okay.
Yeah, so he's kind of the guy who introduced process theology.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that you can, I mean, I guess you could call it evil in some sense, like natural evil. Like even natural evil is a thing in Christian terminology. So yeah, I think disease is termed that. So I think you can have that distinction still. And then moral evil is what occurs with the dawn of not consciousness, but I would say self-reflective consciousness with humans, which seems to be very closely tied up with language, to me. And then at that point, you also get at least more explicit forms of deception, even though, some other greater apes can deceive in some degree. So I guess you could see it's like not purely like a binary, but there's definitely a big shift with human language, I think. And then you get the kinds of like they went into this with other things where Peterson was saying even though the like the relevance realization is inherent, like you don't have a choice with it. At the human level, you still have the choice for whether to follow um, the logos in some sense, where there's more degrees of freedom, basically, like maybe exponentially so at that point in human history that the fall is referring to at the garden. Because before then, um, in some sense, each animal and early hominids were kind of in alignment with their essence, even if they failed, it was largely because of their environment in theory, or because they had bad genes.
Yeah,
Whereas after
we
that,
don't have a capacity for self-deception. That's what,
well,
like,
yeah, that too.
yeah, we can, well, that seems to be like core to, like, we have a capacity to deceive ourselves in a way that no other animal really does, arguably.
Yeah, actually, that's good. Self-deception is perhaps more unique to kind of that shift than deceiving others, because there's like mimicry and so on throughout the animal kingdom that's meant to deceive. So yeah, maybe that's even a more crucial point. And I think like then there's two strands from that point that try to explain it in ways that I think are plausible um, in accordance with evolutionary history and so on. One is Pageau's, where he talks about the breakdown into duality in terms of consciousness, whereas before that there's kind of a seamlessness between the creature and its environment. I mean, I think there's still probably a somewhat of a duality between an animal and its environment, but there wouldn't be the capacity for self-reflection in the sense of, like you said, which could lead to either alienation or self-deception. And then uh, there's that gradual, yeah, so breakdown where the ego makes of itself as a self in what do you call it, like self-positing, uh, in addition to being isolated, as if it could exist purely on its own. And then Ken Lowry, the guy who's talked to Vervaeke a few times, has a good model where um, at the fall, with maybe partially because of language, humans um, started to posit their own consciousness, or their egos more so, as like their ontological source, rather than kind of naively being part of
Right.
the divine manifestation as a creature.
Right. Oh, that okay. So that the last thing you just said, that I want to pick up on that because it touches on, I think I'm really get through this conversation with the three of them, and subsequently I picked up Love and the Postmodern Predicament, and I've been reading that. I'm about a chapter and a half in, so not that far in, but really good.
Yeah,
And
go ahead. I don't want you to forget your thought. I'll get back to it.
well, I've been realizing this like existentially in a new way in
Uh,
just recently. But like this idea that our current moment is like a, well, this sounds like, I don't know. When I put it into words, it sounds like, yes, obviously I'm just restating what like um everyone in this, corner of the internet is saying about our current uh age. But like this idea of the relationship between um like intelligence and reality, or intelligibility and reality, and the notion of like those being wedded together, and like what one of the things that most stood out to me in the conversation was Vervaeke putting that together at the promise of that weddedness, the fact that that promise is inexhaustibly kept is the good.
Yeah.
Uh, that I hadn't. He may have said that elsewhere, but I like it didn't land for me, and that really like that's really landing for me in a
Hmm.
um I don't know, it's in a new way, revelatory way for me. And
After having heard him say that, or even before then, and then he helped articulate it.
um I think it mostly after hearing him say it,
Hmm.
like I was in the right position to, I don't know, for whatever reason it landed the way it did.
Yeah, I
And it's
hadn't heard
just
him
kind of,
explicitly define the good like that before, his definition. So that was very interesting to me.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think I had heard him with beauty described as, you know, beauty is when reality is disclosed to us. Um, and anyway, so I wanted to, he didn't get to truth because I wanted to hear
Yeah.
him give a definition of truth to try and like put that all together. Um, and I don't know if he does that elsewhere, or if these are his definitions, or he's drawing from, there were like multiple different sources he was pulling from when he was
But
talking about that. So
I think he started when he when they started on to the transcendentals and their interconnectivity, he was drawing on DC Schindler, who
yeah,
was himself drawing on Hans von Balthasar, who said the primacy of beauty, the
right.
centrality of goodness, and the ultimacy of truth. And still not sure how he differentiates primacy and centrality. They seem very similar, but yeah, the ultimacy seems quite a bit, well, not quite a bit, but somewhat more distinct. So I'd be curious to hear him say that. And on DC Schindler, I just read his Perfection of Freedom on Schiller, Schelling, and Hegel, which was really great. But that's the only thing I've read of him so far. So I'm hoping to read more. And then a different book that Vervaeke recommended, I just ordered it. Was it last night after I finished? Thomas Plant's The Lost Way to the Good. He was a Christian writing on Neoplatonism who lives in Japan, who is the one talking about the Silk Road and how Neoplatonism afforded the dialogue between the various cultures. And yeah, that book looks amazing. So I'm looking forward to that one.
Huh. Okay.
But
Um,
before, when you were talking about your sort of existential realization of the good, did you want to go into that more, or was there something you wanted to explore about it?
well, just it feels like I'm waking up to something just in the last week, since like sort of triggered by that conversation and then reading Schindler's book. Um, and I'm not even sure that I can yet articulate what exactly
Mm,
I'm getting from it. But like, okay, so what I was just reading was about, you know, um beauty, you know, there's, I don't know, it's this, I'm I'm getting this sense of like I have like theater friends, and a lot of the time when we're talking about uh art, there's you know, the common trope of like, well, it's beauty is subjective, and who are you to judge another piece of art? And it's never quite seemed right to me.
right, because
And
that
but
would
I'm
be
like,
divorcing the beautiful from the true in some sense.
well, it's also divorcing the self from reality. Is that's the fundamental issue. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's not transjective, which is something I keep hammering on with all my friends, that it's not subjective or objective
right, right.
purely. That those are kind of like poles that can't exist in and of themselves.
Right. The fact, okay, so the fact that something strikes me as beautiful, like I'm just gonna say that that's like, well, it just, that's just me, and it has, there's nothing deeper than that. Like that's basically what you're saying when you say that beauty is subjective. It's like,
Well,
but
even then,
but
if you, oh, sorry,
well, I'm like I'm I'm realizing how, I mean, this is showing up in other ways in our culture, and just this, it's, I'm noticing how even that in and of itself, to say something like beauty is subjective, it alienates self from reality and it alienates self from others, and it's like playing into the same process of fragmentation where we're all in our own little reality, and there's no sense that like um there's no sense of like, okay, but there's a common reality that each of us is wedded to, that, and it's like, well, that's I don't know, I'm again, and it's like I'm there's a realization that's happening here that I haven't yet put into words. um
Well, I
but
mean,
it's,
it inevitably has like the political consequences of tribalism that, Pageau is always talking about. If you don't have something that binds people together, then it's basically like a war of smaller groups. And if you say it's purely subjective, like almost the statement itself it implies um, a kind of solipsism almost, or either a solipsism or, um, like you said, a total break of intelligibility and realness. So either way, uh, it's really bad if they try to justify that. Like in trying to justify it, um, it kind of shows up in other areas downstream, not just in aesthetics, obviously.
well, and Schindler is saying like, yeah, that this it, this is core to the feeling of despair that is so prevalent in the culture, um, that we're just, we don't feel like the way he put it was like, yeah, we may feel there's some sort of causal connection between something in the world and then the experience of beauty, but there's no sense of like that weddedness and that intimacy. It's just sort of like mechanistic or something like that. And
Well, yeah, it's still kind of a subject-object dualism, which and he goes
right,
into that a lot in the Perfection of Freedom, um, where it leads to uh, like a kind of, or at least the potential for instrumentalization and violence on both sides if there's not a kind of whole that, or a gestalt that holds together the subject and the object, even while acknowledging them as kind of polar tensions within the greater unity. Oh, there it is. Okay. Um, yeah, I don't know if you had something with what I last said. It was kind of um, like drawing from the book, which I don't know if I gave enough context.
um can you remind me where you left off?
Um, yeah, that basically, if you have the subject object duality that Schindler talks about, then um, either it leads to kind of like instrumentalization or the potential for it for both sides, or yeah, if you don't have a whole or a gestalt that holds together the kind of polar tension between the subject and the object, which still is there, but it can't be fundamental, where you have that kind of yeah, like the mechanistic instrumentalization of one side by the other, or vice versa, or at least the potential for it. And then it's just, well, and then he talks about the issue with freedom in our culture, which is kind of not exactly related directly, but in that book, as basically possibilistic, as like a faculty instead of like one faculty amongst many, as opposed to um the real or the actual itself, like possibilistic in the sense that freedom is just the capacity to do whatever. Whereas, John will often say, or at least that version of freedom is purely an instrumental good. But Schindler is arguing that, freedom properly construed, and John hasn't read this book actually, is not neutral, but a kind of it's a kind of a transjectivity where there's like a perfect affordance between the agent and the arena, I guess you could say, where he defines it as perfect readiness, which combines like form and openness in some sense, and then modifies Hegel's definition, which Hegel said it was freedom was being at home in oneself, in the other. Then Schindler modifies it to being at home with oneself with the other and offering the other a home in oneself. So I've been kind of using that as one of my affirmations since reading the book on a more holistic notion of freedom instead of a kind of neutral possibility, which can be good or evil in the sense that it's purely subjective, and therefore to others it may well end up one or the other. I don't know if that makes sense.
So when you said that this idea of that, like that the relationship, the agent arena relationship, something about like that being
afforded,
there's something complete about it, or not complete, but something ideal, like there's a optimal relationship there. And that made me think like flow state. And I've been thinking about kind of this like self-organizing criticality that John talks about, like it's like insight being a like the dynamics that are going on in the moment of insight is this point of self-organizing criticality. And then like other areas that would show up is like, in a like sexual climax, or like a musical climax experience of some sort of that like moment of things coming together or something like that.
Into a new gestalt.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so that's kind of that, all of that came up when you're talking about this idea of freedom. And I don't know if that maps on well. It seems like that maps on well to like that being, and then the idea of flow state being a cascade of those events, basically an insight cascade. And that being like, that's the point of, maximum freedom, something like that.
Yeah, so he argues that basically throughout keeps hammering home that freedom and form are not opposed, but like interconnected, where freedom is not just the capacity, is not like a capacity or possibility to do something, but the realization of already kind of like an intrinsic capacity, or like an intrinsic logos. And freedom includes the process as well as the realization and the actuality, where actuality, what do you call it, not transposes, but is superior to possibility in some sense, which is what the classical metaphysics like Aquinas asserts, that basically God is like the pure act, and then all creatures partially participate in the pure actuality of the divine. And so I assume that informs his argument somewhat, but basically that yeah, that freedom and form are united in some way. I should be going more over the video since we both just watched it, but since you were mentioning DC Schindler, I guess I wanted to like bring out the main things
Well,
I
this is,
got from that book.
yeah, this is great. I don't have a strict agenda. Um,
Well, actually, before when you were mentioning John's definition of the good, there was a bit
yeah.
where I think Peterson brought up. So if he defined it as the, let's see, how do you define it exactly? Um, the good was the promise of intelligibility, the wedding of reality and intelligibility that we always rely on, even in order to criticize it. And then he argued that Descartes realized this, that clear and distinct ideas must rely on something outside the argument. And then Descartes invokes God, but infamously makes a circular argument for that idea of God. Um, but it seems as though, so if the good is the promise of the wedding of reality and intelligibility, it was just such an odd definition I'd never heard anything like before, where it almost seems as though um, if it's the promise, it kind of very closely seems to associate the good with faith, which is what Peterson brought up.
Mm,
Um, because presumably, at least from our perspective, as one half of the transjective relational reality, the wedding is not always perfect because you have all the sorts of at least self-deception, if not, deception of others or like things breaking down, evil, etc. Um, So yeah, I'm not sure what you made of that, or if you remember that part. They didn't really follow it much, but I remember Peterson bringing it up, and it was something that I had thought right after Vervaeke gave the definition as well, since it was such an odd definition to me. It seemed more like the definition of
I
beauty
remember
almost.
Peterson bringing up Genesis because he asked the question, is that what's referred to in Genesis when God says that creation is good? When did
Oh,
he talk about faith?
um, see, he kind of brought it up, and then they didn't go into it, but that's why I
Oh,
wanted to bring
okay.
it up because it was something I thought of as well because of the wording of the good as the promise of the wedding of reality and intelligibility. The promise, it
Promise.
implies, something because I assume John wouldn't say it's perfectly, 100% there at all points, at least from our perspective. And therefore, I remember we were talking about this defining faith at the retreat as kind of
Right.
um, the trust of the ultimate convergence of reality, intelligibility, the transcendentals, etc. And therefore, it seems like John's definition of the good, it seems very either presupposing faith or it's very close, not close to it, but it seems as though it would be part of the kind of actualization of or perception of the good or realizing of the good for humans in some sense.
How would you rephrase that definition to take the faith element out of it?
uh yeah, that's an interesting way to put it because my definite I don't even know if I had quite a definition. It was more of a vague gestalt. When I think of the good, like just all my reading or listening of Plato just kind of has this sort of vague sensation that is very nonetheless inspiring to me. Um, and then Whitehead's sort of definition of each actual occasion, so each moment of reality, there's like an ideal version of what that could be, which the kind of subjective lure of God is calling to, but there's also the capacity that may well involve and always does to some extent involve novelty and creativity and leads to greater integration and harmony between all the different things from past and future that are going into that moment. So that's kind of how I typically think of it in that vague, like partially imagistic sense. But I'm not sure if I should or would want to remove the element of faith from John's definition. But I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on whether it seems like it would be part of it, because yeah, my definition was just quite different.
Yeah, I think I haven't thought enough about, I haven't tried to define the good for myself, so I haven't thought enough about this. And so that's why I asked, because I wanted to like what would, yeah, what would be the alternative to um kind of this posture of faith, uh sort of wrapped up in the good. Like that's what I'm not even clear on what that, uh I don't know. I guess I'm not clearly seeing the distinction between um the distinction you're trying to make. I guess like I don't have a good, I'm not grokking that between like the good being defined sort of it wrapped up in this notion of faith versus not wrapped up in that's what I'm
Oh,
struggling.
I see. So yeah, I guess outside of his definition, it seemed to me more of a simultaneously something that's like substantial but transcendent in some sense, and then also something that each moment and each decision can like partially reach toward but never perfectly express, but it can get asymptotically closer to it. Whereas his definition as the good is the promise of the wedding of reality and intelligibility that we always rely on. Um, it, yeah, I guess it makes it less connected to action or ethics in an interesting way, but he would say it like grounds ethics, which they talked about as well. Like ethics flows out of it, um, but it's kind of pre-ethical in some sense. I guess it was the word promise that
Yeah, yeah.
made the connection to me with faith.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about it more. I don't have any yeah. I mean, even the true, the good and the beautiful, like this is not something that I mean, you have like a much more rich philosophical background, it feels like, than I have. And so like
I don't know.
this is really the first time I'm like really grappling with like true and the good and the beautiful, and like really like, okay, what are they? How do they, you know, relate to each other? How are they unified? Um and so yeah, I haven't thought enough about it. Um, so yeah, I mean the okay, so the next thing I had on here was like this idea of unifying the transcendentals. And yeah, I mean I feel like I'm maybe I'm not, I don't know. I don't know if that I have anything to say about that right now. But I'm curious what, 'cause I'm wishing that John had gotten to the truth, like they had gone into that more, but I guess it was kind of like, I don't know. Um, yeah, yeah, I don't know. Is there anything alive for you around like the unification?
Well, I guess ironically, I was just listening to John's first debate with Yosha Bach, because I know Hunter from the Retreat was really hyping him up, and Kurt Jaimungal had asked, "What's something you've changed on within the last 2 years?" And John had mentioned that, uh, especially through reading people like DC Schindler, he kind of post fact or retrospectively realized he had started kind of undermining his long held assumptions, like scientific assumptions about the fact value distinction, especially, and the separate domains of the transcendentals, which is something that, who was it? Habermas. But that a lot of, well, obviously Hume did the fact value distinction, I guess, that a lot of modernity has assumed, and I also very much assumed up until the last few years or so. And I think that's definitely connected to the, what is the word? It's not translatability, but convertibility, I think, between the transcendentals. Like they're not, well, they're I don't even know if they're identical in God, maybe in like the essence of God in the classical language, but that they for sure have distinctness to us, even though their full expressions are, ultimately in harmony, even though like David Bentley Hart will talk about how in the, in our fallen history, whether you want to say history or time, which kind of gets back to how you metaphysically define the fall. I don't think you have to say this though, but within the context of, say, the classical question of like if you're hiding Jews in your house during the Holocaust and the Nazis ask like, do you have any? Then David Bentley Hart had this chapter in his most recent book arguing that the transcendentals are sometimes in conflict at the level of, like the finite expression, or they seem to be, um, especially if you have a reductive notion of one of them in our sort of fallen history, and therefore uh, telling the Nazis something that is, factually not the case would still be not only a loyalty to the good and the beautiful, but a loyalty to ultimate truth in some sense, because the true world does not include that kind of genocide or murder. I'm making his argument seem much more simplistic than it is, but that kind of brought back to me also like how it would tie into the fact value distinction. Yeah, what do you make of the fact value distinction, how it would relate to the transcendentals coming together? Because I thought it was interesting how John noticed himself now questioning that, having read especially like DC Schindler and stuff the last couple of years.
Fact value distinction. Well, okay, that makes me think of like the discussions that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had way back, several years ago. And then it also touches on the other thing is like what they started with at the beginning of this conversation about basically perception is already
a value judgment.
Value. It's a value. What's the word? You're prioritizing.
Yeah. Through relevance realization,
right?
It's like subconscious.
And so, in order to, so I guess in order, with that in mind, in order to perceive facts about the world, you're already at that point prioritizing what to attend to and what not to attend to. And well, maybe this idea of like aspectualization comes into that. Like if you're aspectualized, because that's what you're doing, right? When you're perceiving, and you're prioritizing, you're drawing out certain aspects of the world, ignoring other aspects, and that is already a valuing. You're already valuing in that, and those aspects would be the facts or something like that. The facts.
Yeah, but at the very least, the process of coming to the fact is a value judgment. But I guess the question is whether the fact itself is a value judgment. I feel like in some sense it is, even if it's just a value judgment in the sense of the normativity of a truth statement. If you think truth is normative, then it's intrinsically a value judgment if you think it's the case, I suppose. I mean, in that trivial sense, I guess you could say there's no such thing as a total fact value distinction, maybe. I don't know if that makes sense though. In addition to the kind of pre-conscious relevance realization of aspectualizing, like you said, from the combinatorial explosiveness of what you could
Right.
um, decide on as a fact to explicate.
So can you say that again? In addition to that,
So there's like two things. There's what you were pointing out, which is the pre-conscious relevance realization of
yeah,
coming to the decision of aspectualizing a certain thing via your value structures, which is mostly implicit, and then the fact itself, even you can still, at the very least, always argue that it is value laden in the sense of making some kind of truth claim. So, assuming you think truth is normative, which, as John
right.
always says, you have to if you want to do science.
So the fact is value laden because it's relevant to us, it's important to us, like because the truth is important. Is that the idea?
Yeah, yeah. I guess if someone claims they don't value the truth and they, you know, read the fact, then I mean they could claim that the fact is not value laden, but even that in and of itself is a judgment and is a value statement. So,
Yeah.
well, Vervaeke was saying Hume's issue. Actually, yeah, he got very explicit on this. I had another point, some writing before I forget it because it was related. But he said Hume couldn't get past the problem of induction. Oh, wait, I guess this isn't fact value distinction. But he also introduced that because it requires faith in the goodness of intelligibility, which is reliable and inexhaustible, though not algorithmic or reducible. It's like the next note in a symphony, not perfectly predictable, but it will make sense. Hence why we like music, because it reflects how we see patterns first and then make some of them into objects. I thought it was going to be about the fact value distinction. So now I'm not sure if this is relevant to what we were just talking about. But I really liked that part when Peterson was saying it's like the next note in a piece of music.
Yeah.
Like it will make it if it's a good piece of music. It's not perfectly predictable, but it will make some degree of sense. Because because Hume said there's no such thing as causality, and then I think I sent you this video, the video of Bernardo Castro talking to Matt Segal on Whitehead. Matt Segal is kind of a Whitehead promoter. Matt was saying how Hume, in and of him, in his own statements of saying that we see things, for example, or hear things, that already is an instance of causality, as Whitehead said about Hume. So he's already kind of undermining his statement that um, there is no causality, or at least we can't perceive it, because even to perceive something, there's already a causal connection between your sense organ and the object that's being perceived from the world into your sensory perception. Um, so
Why
I've
did why did Hume say that there's no causality? I don't understand that.
Yeah, because I think and Alexander Bard has critiqued this as well, and Bernardo, that he was trying to view things kind of abstracted from the flow of time, such that if you and because it's not perfectly predictable in some sense, like even something simple like you cut I don't know, you prune a tree branch and then it falls to the ground. Um like if you take each act in isolation, you can't perfectly predict what will happen, and each occurrence is not like the connection between them is not foolproof. I don't remember his actual arguments, but in some sense, he's trying to like abstract from time, and then also forgetting that he's already presuming, or you have to presume some degree of causality in order to assume there's intelligibility to your sense perceptions. And then Vervaeke further was saying he couldn't get past the problem of induction,
Hmm.
which is extrapolating from a pattern, because it requires faith in the goodness of intelligibility. which is inexhaustible though not algorithmic or
I think
reducible. So it's like more of a right
I
hemisphere
was
thing.
just I think that's I think Schindler says something about that about Hume, is that, or maybe I heard that, was that in the conversation that Vervaeke, the three-way conversation that
Yeah, he brought up. I
that
was basically almost a quote, more of a paraphrase, what
oh,
I
but
was saying
yeah,
there
because I
about
was
Hume.
I'm getting confused where I'm like I heard that somewhere.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah,
does that make sense?
you can't make inductive um you can't make inductions an induct
Algorithmic.
right. Right. It's not algorithmic, but and so you have to have a certain faith in the intelligibility of reality in
Yeah,
order
and
to.
I think that also brings faith back in as connected to like the disclosure of intelligibility, maybe, or at least like the process of
Okay, so
reaching that.
going back, okay, the promise thing. The promise is seems like the object of the faith, isn't it? Is a promise?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, the promise is the thing I have faith in.
Or
That
the
feels
kind of
that's yeah, I guess.
the promise or the character of the promise giver, I guess, depending on how much you want to personalize reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it would be faith if you're defining the good as the promise kept, then it's faith. Faith in the good would be faith in the promise. I guess that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And then, yeah, like I said, like Platonism just wouldn't personalize it as much. It would have the good. Well, actually, I guess Plato did say that the, or no, did he say the good is beyond being, or that the highest thing is beyond being and the good? I forget now. But Vervaeke's been over this before. Anyway, there's not disagreement there between Platonism and Christianity anyway, so that's fine. You know, like
Okay.
Pageau will
What?
say that God is beyond being or being and non-being, um, uh, apophaticism, etc.
I wanted to bring up the. I've been wrestling with this question. I mentioned it to John on the retreat at some point, like this the the ontological status of agency and um and it wasn't even really that they didn't this wasn't really talked about explicitly in the conversation, but for whatever reason that came up for me and um and somehow I don't know, it has there's a I'm reaching here, but there's a similar, it feels almost like there's a similar thing I'm wrestling with regard to the narrative thing. Um, and I don't know if there's actually a connection, but it feels like there might be, but I'm kind of reaching. Um, and so one thing that really stood out to me about the narrative thing was when John brought up music, and how music, if you think that any sequence of events is necessarily a narrative, then you would say that, like music, a musical pattern is necessarily a narrative. And that to me is like the core of this, because to me, like I look at reality and I see it has like that it is music. There's a fundamental musical quality to it. And so really at the core of the question of is narrative sort of fundamental or not is this question of is music narrative
Hmm.
in its nature. Like I thought that was really that was the crucial question for me. And I don't even know then what I wanted them to do is like, okay, can you just actually define narrative? Because they never really actually did that.
Yeah.
And so that's a big that's I don't do you have a definition of
Well, they did say that one of the necessary conditions is that it has to have goal, I think, like an endpoint. And I mean, I guess you could say that any musical composition has a endpoint, but I feel like it doesn't encompass the whole the way that, the end of a story might. Like in both senses, like the end of a story, like say a book, a novel, and the end of a musical composition are both ends, but somehow I feel like the end of a story is more significant in the sense of the last line or whatever rather than the last line of music, especially because say in a lot of songs they'll have kind of a fade out, for example. And I feel like with music, the important thing, even if the most important thing in a story is the whole story itself, I feel like in music it's more obviously the case that the important thing is the whole, or at least each moment flowing into the next one. Whereas with a story, I think you could argue somewhat more that the end of a story is more important to understanding it than the end of a musical composition. So in that sense, I don't think, they're a narrative to the same degree. I
Well,
think a song or music is like pre-narrative in some sense because you can project narratives onto it.
right.
It affords that, but it's not.
Right. There's certain
There's a
types of music
diversity.
that have a more like narrative structure to
Well,
it.
that's
Like,
also true.
right.
Yeah.
Where it feels like, okay, the music is going somewhere, like it's taking you somewhere. Whereas other types of music, it's more just like it's it's less of this and it's more just like, okay, we're just sort of it's more repetitive, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, and now
Is
I'm
it
trying to
kind
think
of
if you have something equivalent in stories. I feel like stories tend to be more teleological in a unified, uh less diverse way compared to music where you have like elevator music or something where it doesn't feel teleological at all almost. Like are there
right?
story genres that are more like elevator music? I don't know.
Well,
That is like
I'm also like noticing like um there's aspects of music that are more like contextual. They frame like even in a
yeah.
piece of music that's narrative in nature, like more narrative has a more narrative like structure. There's parts of that music which are more just like the container for the narrative. You have like, the bass line, and then you have the melody on top of that. And like
Oh,
down
I see what you're
here
saying.
is like it's more just like I'm holding the space for the narrative or something like that.
Well, I guess if you want to break it down to that extent, you could say the equivalent there in a story would be like the setting, say, and the melody would be like the character's actions.
Right, right.
I thought you were going to say that music can be more contextual in the sense that it's not so self-contained, in the sense that there's music that's specifically recorded for background to a different piece of art, like a movie or a video game
Right.
or elevator music. Whereas a
Right.
story, well, maybe I'm thinking a story too much in the sense of like a novel or a myth, but they seem more whole or self-contained across genres almost. I don't know if that's relevant though. Like music seems more versatile in that sense, I guess you could say, which is maybe a positive for its correlation to reality.
Well, okay, so part of the argument that Peterson was trying to make was following from the previous premises that he laid out, which was what we were talking about with the aspectualization from, I mean, he doesn't talk about aspectualization, but I'm merging it with John's stuff.
Mhm.
Uh about how we are already what he wants to say is we're already looking through a narrative lens or something like that, or we're already um in the very act of perception, we are narrativizing reality, or reality is already narrative. Like that he wants to put the narrative in there from the very act of perception itself.
Yeah. And this is what I was gonna This is what I was writing down earlier that I wanted to touch on, so I'm glad we got back to it. This is uh well, maybe I didn't think of it till now, but I would criticize Pageau and Peterson here, but I think they may have what do you call it? Soften their positions or come closer to John and his distinctions, where I would say to the degree that both of them were claiming that, I think they're conflating like prioritization and normativity and value ladenness with narrative, because for sure to perceive you have to prioritize, because Vervaeke knows all about that with relevance realization, but he's wanting to have a clear distinction between the value ladenness of our perception and prioritization and hierarchy and so on, and narrative, which also includes like teleology, but is even more than that. Like it's something that he'll bring up that you have to learn. And then Peterson acknowledged that there's pre-narrative structures for like talking to infants or whatever, but it's not narrative yet. So I think that was a key part, like distinguishing between the value ladenness of perceptions and narrative. What do you think?
What I'm well, I don't know why this is such a. I think the reason I'm so confounded by this whole discussion is that I don't really. I like what okay, define narrative for me, because that seems to be the like Peterson and Pageau are trying to like stretch the definition of narrative, and it feels like they have some sort of implicit definition of narrative that they're working with, and Vervaeke has a more explicit definition of narrative that he's assuming and saying, like, no, this isn't, I'm differentiating narrative from these other things. But then they don't just come out and say, like, okay, this is how I'm defining narrative. And like I want Peterson and Pageau to do that. Like, what do you mean by narrative? Like
Yeah,
you're
that'd
just
be great.
using the word narrative.
Like he said, as you were saying, they're stretching the definition in a way that trivializes it and like it makes it too thin.
Yeah, exactly.
And I agree with him on that. Like,
But then, okay, the question is, um, well, it's a really interesting. I just keep coming back to the like, um, okay, so there's something about I was talking about agency, the ontology of agency. It seems like agency is agency a relevant factor in narrative, like in the definition of narrative. Like, do you need like, and now I'm like trying to, okay, like, can you frame something as a narrative that doesn't involve an agent seeking a goal? Like, and then that teleology being a core component of narrative, like you were mentioning, can you talk about teleology without agency? And this is, can you see why I'm now trying to I'm now realizing, okay, this is why in actually articulating it, this is why the ontology of agency seems like a relevant factor in the ontology of narrative. Or
yeah,
yeah.
that's really good. I think it definitely is connected. And now I was thinking of imagining a story about the like the first few billion years of the planet Earth, say before life emerged. I guess it depends on whether you are like a pan experientialist or panpsychist on all the rocks and stuff, or if you think there's already a cosmic plan, whether that would qualify as the agency or teleology. Um, maybe to the degree that certainly to the degree that it's like a successful story in the broad sense, I think they are almost always there. But that's kind of obvious, I suppose. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, like this this is such a like a this is really at the edge for me. Something that so something I was talking to John about briefly was um I mean I was so one of the things I talked to you about was I'm trying to bridge between the level of life and the level of matter,
Mm,
um, which is again like I'm searching for, does agency go deeper than life? That's the first question, really. Or is that, and Vervaeke like clearly says no, it doesn't. Like agency is something that emerges at the level of biological systems, and you prior to that you have self-organizing systems like a tornado, but it's not seeking out the conditions necessary to maintain itself,
hmm
maintain its structural functional integrity. And so, but then, okay, do I agree with that? I mean, if you define agency that way, I guess I would have to, agree with that. But I don't know.
As something seeking out the conditions for its own continued existence.
Right. If you define agency that way, do you see agency anywhere other than biological systems and the systems, cultural systems that emerge out of that?
Well, actually, I don't know if that's the best definition, since, at the human level, you can have, or even at the animal level, you can have agency that is specifically self-sacrificial for the sake of, other members of its own species, for example.
Okay, so you're saying that the definition is too uh reductive in the like in
Seems like it would only apply to like very simple organisms at
right.
at, at every point,
Well, would
since
it,
there's exceptions.
I don't, okay, so the idea of self-sacrifice, but what is um there's something problematic about that when you consider like how does that, when you take an evolutionary perspective, how does a pattern of self-sacrifice actually uh propagate itself? You could argue that in order to do that, there has to be self-sacrifice towards a larger uh something larger that that smaller self participates in, and that somehow it's through that larger self that the pattern of self-sacrifice.
Yeah, you can modify it very slightly and say it's self-organization plus seeking out the conditions for the continued existence of that class of being or its own species. But even then, you could get some exceptions, like a human sacrificing themselves for an endangered species or something. But I mean, you could modify it if you want. But the point is that there's the capacity for, I guess you could say, the capacity for seeking out the conditions for some sort of continuity of of anything. Um,
Well, I think
yeah.
I think what you're bringing up might be the what's the boundary of the system in question, maybe,
Hmm.
which is like what's the boundary of the self or something like that, which is I think because I okay, let's start with just a pure self-organizing system like a tornado. What would be the added factor that would make that a living system? It would be it's seeking to maintain the way in which it's organized, but then the question is what is the it that is organized in that way? And like I don't know, I don't know if what I'm saying is entirely clear, but it seems like maybe what you were bringing up was that what's the boundary of the system in question?
Yeah, for sure. Um, and then I thought you could also take the example that Peterson often gives of someone full of resentment who just wants to, end other systems or other beings' existence, but they're still exercising agency, but it's agency for the sake of reducing agency in some sense. Of
Okay, yeah. Um,
course, I mean you could make that into a smaller example of like predator animals, but that's still for the sake of their own continued agency, I suppose. Like for a tornado, if you want it to still be a tornado, it would, seek out other conditions of like hot and cool air mixing, I suppose. But I'm not sure
okay, but there's
how that would help.
there's levels of agency too. That's the thing here is that and Vervaeke would agree with this that you can have like I'm part of collective intelligences that have their own agency, and then the cells within my body have their own agency. And so this is why the boundary of like when you're talking about okay, what when I'm trying and when I'm maintaining my structural functional organization, what is my structural functional organization? Is it
Mm.
like what that's what I that's it seems like okay, that has to include the all of the agencies that I am participating in or
Above and below.
that are participating in me, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because we're cultural animals and therefore, rely on distributed cognition and collective intelligence, then yeah, you could say even to be selfish, successfully selfish, unless you're like a master survivalist, you would also try to maintain the structural functional organization of your tribe or your family, etc., so that you can survive. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay, so with that in mind, uh trying to okay, where were we? We were on this question of agency and narrative. And yeah, what's the question here that I'm trying to ask?
Well, you were trying to define narrative, and
Yeah.
if it needs to have teleology or a goal, does that also not imply it needs to have agency as part of it? Can you have teleology or a goal without agency? And I was thinking like, could you write a story about, you know, the history of Earth up until right before the first organisms? Um, say, I guess if you write it from an atheistic perspective, could that be construed as a narrative, or even like a materialist perspective as well? Like there's no consciousness. Could it be construed as a story? Hmm.
Well, I mean, that's tricky because like maybe this is part of what Peterson was trying to say was that he was saying like the pattern of behavior of the wolves, the wolf pack, or whatever he was using as an example, is not a narrative, but the description of the pattern of behavior is a narrative or something like that. And then
Yeah, actually,
that's where Vervaeke seemed to agree. He's like, oh, okay, I think we might be in agreement here. So
yeah,
like if you're laying out the history of the universe, the when you're talking about the behavior of the universe from the Big Bang or whatever, uh, the behavior itself is not a narrative. But when I put a description, say this happened, followed by this and this and this, and toward the. Well, I'm not even so sure about that because again, you're not. It is that a narrative really because you're describing a sequence of events, but then that comes back to the issue of music. Is that the same? Is that the same thing as music? As like one
mm, mm.
following another, or
Yeah,
is it
that's
different because I'm describing it in language? I'm saying this event followed this.
yeah, that's a good comparison because I was going to say similar similar to you. I was imagining what Jonathan would say, and he'd probably say that describing the history of the universe or the Earth up to the point of the emergence of life is still a story because you're projecting your own teleological understanding of things and you
Right.
know how it's going to end, and therefore the act of describing it, you're injecting or projecting narrative into it, even if there was none before then. But then, so I was totally on board, but then you did bring up how that's rather similar to music in the sense that there's no agents. And so the distinction I made before is that the end of a story seems to be more important than the end, like the last note of a piece of music.
Right.
So what would it be? I guess like the hydrothermal vent. The hydrothermal vents would be the end of the story right before the first life forms. Uh, is that significantly different enough from the end of a point of music that it is a narrative? I feel like it's in between a typical story and a musical composition somehow. I'm always a fan of gradients and spectrums, so that's my own bias though.
So what do you can you say more about the what you think is the difference between the end of a story and the end of a piece of music? I know you touched on that a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can.
Right. Well, I guess it's just kind of an intuitive thing. I hadn't thought of it before, but just for example, well, think of it in terms of like our generation caring about spoilers. Like it's not a spoiler to say, oh, this piece of music ends on like B flat. Whereas if you say like the last chapter or describe, what happens in the last chapter of a huge novel, people are going to feel like they have more knowledge of the whole than they would if they knew the last few notes of the piece of music. Maybe because it incorporates agency.
Well, okay, if a very skilled musician who has a very, like just a ridiculous good ear and musical imagination, if they're listening to a piece of music and you tell them, and they have perfect pitch and they can, they're tracking, what key it's in, kind of have a sense of where it's going, and you tell them, uh, okay, this piece is actually going to end in the key of B flat or whatever, and it's going to end in this particular way. Like, I don't know, could you see that as like, someone who can actually has the capacity to imagine that and hear it in their head, uh could you see, like, would that be a
A spoiler?
equivalent of a spoil, like, oh, you spoiled the piece of music?
No, I don't think so. I think this gets back to what they were talking about, where Peterson said, contra Hume, and Vervaeke was agreeing that intelligibility is not algorithmic in the sense that the next thing that happens is like the next note, in that it's not perfectly predictable. So therefore, I think even if they knew the last note or even the last few notes, I don't think they could. I mean, I'm not like a super skilled musician or anything, but I don't think they would be able to predict that there's only one way that it could
Well,
happen.
let's say someone gave them the score of the end of the piece of music, and it's a very skilled musician, and so it's someone who can look, and there are people like this, they're rare, where they're well trained enough and they're just have enough talent where they can look at a piece of music like a full score and hear it in their head,
Hmm.
and that, and and it, so like, and it's not going to be the same, but it's I imagine that's something equivalent to, like, you hear about the end of this story, like, oh, this is how, this
No.
story ends, and you didn't go watch the movie, you didn't go read the book, but you heard about the end of the story, and that somehow spoil it. Like, I imagine there's some way in which you could spoil the end of a piece of music, like if you hear it in your head before you actually get to that point. I like, is
Oh, yeah. In some sense, it's a little bit spoiled, I guess. But I would say that even a skilled musician or not, like hearing, like having an audio recording of the last 30 seconds, versus someone being told in bad paraphrase the end of a novel. I still think the person being spoiled about the novel, that would be more, they would know more about the whole than the skilled musician even hearing the audio recording, because I still think that there could be a variety of ways it could get to that last 30 seconds of the recording. And um it's not, like there's many forms of music, like I mentioned before, that they can fade out as the final 30 seconds, right? They can repeat the same little refrain, and it may or may not tell you what came before, as opposed to like the kind of more maybe a classical. I'm not skilled in music, like I said, but a more sort of piece of classical music where
Something
it
that has a
gets
nice
to
end.
this big culmination,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So this is interesting because I'm noticing a lot of this has to do with uh we consciousness can make sense of narrative in a way it navigates narrative in a way that it doesn't music. Like when you brought up you get the end of the piece of a novel, you're going to see there's going to be a very limited number of ways when you're reading the beginning of that novel that you start piecing together, okay, how is this going to get to the end? There's going to be a very limited number of ways. Like you can really break that down pretty fast. Depending on the complexity of the story, you can kind of start piecing that together more and more as you go along. With a piece of music, it seems like much more open-ended. How am I going to get from, I mean, at this point in the music, how am I going to get, I know the ending, but how am I going to get there? That seems much more open-ended in nature. And so what is that? That's like, is it just a less constrained system that you're dealing with? And so because music has fewer constraints on it than sort of like a linguistic narrative system, is that why there are fewer, like there's fewer constraints?
Well, even if you somehow try to stretch it in the opposite direction, if you try to say, for some reason, you're given the end of the story and it's significant in some sense, and yet having read the first chapter, it's so different that there could be like innumerable ways it got to that ending point, and yet it's still very informative and impactful, and you wish you didn't know it. Versus, say, a piece of music where the beginning and the end um, are close enough that you can like have a decently close theory to how it got there. I would still say that the person being spoiled at the end of the story has been given like more information in some sense, or like more critical information. And it may be tied to what you're saying about the constraints, but I think also like the form of music is more about the whole and like the present moment flowing into the next moment, whereas the kind of form of a story is more about a linear trajectory that kind of reaches a culminating thing that sums it up. Like, I'm not sure that the end of a musical composition necessarily sums it up or can sum up the piece as a whole the way that an end of a story can sum up the story as a whole, even if there's also, like you said, less constraints on music. For example, because there's agents in a story that, like John would say, have bioeconomies and like they're, fighting entropy and so on in a way that the musical composition isn't. Like it's more open-ended.
I wonder if poetry might like as you move from narrative more into poetry, does that like that seems obvious that that takes you slightly closer to music. And then what is like maybe that there's some insight to be gained from looking at something like poetry.
No, I think it is a middle ground, like you said.
Yeah.
Um, I guess also music can have a story if there's lyrics. I always like instrumental music anyway. Um, so I feel like I always have kind of a bias against narrative emphasis, so I feel very sympathetic to Vervaeke when he's like wanting to
Interesting.
prevent kind of narrative reduction. Um,
Why do you think, because I'm the same way, I like instrumental music. Why do you think you have a bias that way?
well, I guess because like when I think in talks with Paul Vanderklay, John has said imagining the ultimate as like a being or a person would kind of reduce it in some sense and make it like kind of less ineffable or less absolute or kind of not sublime, numinous or mysterious or awe-inspiring. And so I don't want to say impersonal, but you could say that, I suppose, or transpersonal instrumental music, I think, in that same sense, is a little bit more like open-ended and non-anthropomorphic compared to lyrical music. And I feel like lyrical music, either you have to have more skill and empathy, or you have to ideally have a similar experience as the person who wrote the song, ideally to relate to it. And maybe it's because like, a lot of songs in our age are kind of about like romance stuff, and they've never compelled me very much. But yeah, I think I don't want to go into MBTI stuff, but maybe, or what would the big five be? Maybe um, I feel like there might be a connection between extroversion, introversion spectrum, and then maybe
Mm, interesting.
the neuroticism one. Yeah, because it's,
Thought
well,
of that.
actually, Peterson has very briefly talked about this where he was trying to bring up the adaptability or adaptivity of each of the big five emphases. And I used to be obsessed with introversion and very biased against extroverts when I was young. And yeah, I was very against that whole thing. But he brought up how the specialty, like the evolutionary adaptivity of all these things, that for introversion, it may have been nature in contrast to culture.
Right.
And I definitely latched onto that. It felt very intuitively correct to me because I always wanted to just be like a hermit living in the forest. Um, and so, especially as like hunter gatherers, where culture is not so institutionalized, I could see that being a trait. What do you call it? Density dependent selection trait.
Then are you trying to draw a connection between nature and music, and then between culture and language? Like, because
Well,
it,
and maybe narrative too, and then also between instrumental music and lyrical music. Yeah,
right, right.
like
You're
all
right.
of those would be
Yeah.
one side, the other side. Yeah.
Interesting. I thought it was interesting what you were saying about this is really interesting that God, or whatever you want to, whatever word you want to use for that, that the quality of that is more like music. It's more like the quality of music, like when you're listening to instrumental music, there's something about that open-ended quality to it that's more than a person. And that's really interesting. And then what is a person? Sorry, I'm just I'm going.
Oh, that's good.
I thought that was really interesting. Um because something that John said when I was talking to him about agency and sort of the fundamental, like how fundamental is agency, he he said basically, I think like fundamental reality is more like a tornado than a um an agent, like a living a biological system or something like that, an agent. And and that to me, like something about the tornado just like invokes chaos, or
Yeah.
evokes chaos, and it's like, well, that's not quite right, but I know what he's getting at. Um and and then it and then the another thing is like in his he had a conversation with, it was Paul Vanderklay and Mary Cohen, I
Hmm.
think. And at one point, there's sort of like a pivotal moment in the discussion. This was a couple of years ago, probably. Um, it sort of came up like Paul and Mary both see sort of the ground of being as a person, like there's a personal quality. And Vervaeke's like, well, I just don't see it that way. And that was where sort of they got to the fundamental
Mm,
impact. Like
mm.
from a like phenomenologically, the way they relate to that is just it's different. And
Yeah.
and so that's
I,
really interesting.
I think I remember that exact video, and I remember commenting on it. I think Mary might have responded. I don't know if she responded, and I was making a very similar point to the one I just made to you, that I think um, it's partially a temperamental difference in how people view not just, fundamental reality, but in general, whether they tend toward viewing things as like on the narrative and personal side, or the um yeah, non-narrative and more impersonal slash transpersonal. Um, but even Paul's own kind of uh, definitions accounts for this, where he talks about God number one and God number two, the agent and the arena. So God is both agent and arena. And so I think there's, even you could say, a adaptive, evolved temperamental bias, but a complementary bias within humans toward viewing things more as agents or as arenas, but you need both
Interesting.
to some extent. And like I yeah, viewing it, the arena, as personal and having agency, I think is a fine way to kind of combine them. But yeah, I think it's not like it's partially temperamental, and then people learn it depending on how they're instructed. Obviously, it's gonna impact them in their formative years as well. And that's why I like Pageau is very helpful for probably a lot of people who have already kind of developed to the extent that it's very difficult for them to see reality as like person like, um and therefore his, more apophatic, mystical theology of God is beyond being and non-being, I think is very helpful, because similar to John, whenever I, imagine reality in that kind of more explicit person like way, it feels very um reductive and kind of almost disrespectful to reality, like boxing it in or making it more narrow in some sense. In addition to feeling very implausible. Uh, and I think, going back to the music example, I think music being more open-ended in some sense relates to how John, often in his talks with Paul, will emphasize how he thinks like the teleology has to be open-ended in some sense, because there's always the moreness. And then Paul actually was sympathetic to this, citing, I think, the last battle with C.S. Lewis, talking about one of the last lines were, um, further up and further in, like, and then I know both Pageau and David Bentley Hart will talk about Gregory of Nyssa's eschatology as a kind of infinite epictasis, or like stretching out into the infinity, which is God, rather than a stasis. Um, I think that language is also very helpful and more plausible and intelligible to me, especially if you take infinity seriously.
Well, I'm wondering also this idea of like um sort of the process of moving toward, let's say, theosis in the Orthodox tradition. It's like you're climbing up these ontological layers, and are you like as you move towards union with God, are you as a person does a person become more like music? I don't know what that means exactly, but like as you like where like I'm can you bridge between what you're trying to distinguish? There's something about God, ultimate reality, that is distinct from a person, but then there's also this idea in at least Orthodox Christianity that like there's a there's a continuous line from person, human, to God, like through a process of sanctification, like
Well,
and
and in the reverse direction in the incarnation, that there's not a
right, exactly.
competition between them.
Right. So that's really interesting. Um, well, brought up the question for me earlier, like what is a person? And like when we perceive, you know how you can like personify something, or you can be out in nature. And when we were doing our sit spot thing, it was like, I can relate to this tree as if it's, you know, it has some sort of intelligence, and it can, um, it, it perceives me, and I can talk to it or something. And it's,
Hmm.
I can make it alive, like this sort of animistic quality.
Hmm.
But what is it that I'm actually, what is it about the tree that makes it seem more like a person, although it's not exactly a person, but there's a animating spirit behind it. And what is that exactly? Because it's like we have that agent detection thing, like we can detect other agents. And what is it exactly that we're detecting? What is an agent fundamentally? And then how does that how is that continuous with, as you climb up the ontological ladder to God, what is what is that? And then the other way, like you mentioned in the incarnation.
Mm.
Makes sense what I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe you're speculating that a person is kind of the midway point, or it's specifically most exemplified in humans rather than high above or way below.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, there's something. I my experience of in talking through this is like we take for granted like the category of person.
Yeah, I was going to go into that.
And I'm like, well, what is what is that? Just the question, what is that? And then is that deeper than, like, it seems like there's a, yeah, and this is connecting with the what, how fundamental is agency? What's the ontology of agency? And
Mm.
there uh well, yeah, it's interesting thinking about up and down, like you were saying, because in some sense I think of God as like God is both, the bottom and the top,
Yeah,
source and the um
the
uh
ground of being and the form of forms.
right, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm like, which way am I going here? But like, um but even that is interesting. So yeah, that there's, anyway, I don't have coherent words are not being formulated here, but um I think you understand kind of what I'm wrestling with here.
Yeah, well, you drew out many different thoughts.
Yeah.
So I think they did touch on this where when they were arguing about narrative, John, on behalf of Christianity, reminded that it claims the ultimate is not a narrative but a person, that the logos is a person, not a narrative. But then, and he brought up the point that I was going to make is, and that you were also bringing up is, we kind of take for granted the term person, which is actually a translation from the Greek hypostasis, because as David Bentley Hart will talk about, it was Trinitarian discussions and arguments about doctrine that led to this concept of the three hypostases in one ousia, which is essence. So three persons in one essence, which is Trinitarian basic um, Orthodox
And
doctrine.
what is the hypostasis? What is that? I don't have, like, what is it, to stand under or something?
Yeah, so
I never
Vervaeke,
really understood what does that
I
mean?
think I've heard two direct translations, and Vervaeke in that talk mentioned one of them, which is that which stands under. which is very vague. And then another one I've heard is subsistent relation, which makes more sense to me. That's usually the one I think of. So I think, and David Bentley Hart makes this argument that in the West, our concept of person started because of Christian doctrinal debates, and then has kind of mutated over time to the point where we now think of it in a much more, because of like post Descartes, we have a much more individualistic concept of what a person is, which may not have been, in the minds of people when they were talking about the Trinity as subsistent relation, which makes a lot more sense with what they're talking about with the Trinity to me. As opposed to now, I think it's often conflated with individual, whereas I think person, one good way of thinking about it is like a nexus of relationships, whereas an individual tends toward a kind of isolated atomism. But I think there can be too much of a conflation when talking about God, of projecting our idea of like a isolated individual being, and then thinking of God or the Trinity as like persons in that sense, because that ends up being more like tritheism, right? As opposed to subsistent relation or that which stands under. Um, I think a lot of probably modern Protestant Christians have kind of implicit tritheism without really acknowledging it as such. That kind of projection of our own modern understanding of the individual as a person onto God as a kind of, especially modern, maybe more likely Protestant, I would say, form of unaware idolatry in some sense, which causes a lot of people, what do you call it, exaggerated or um, what's the word, accentuated, but in a negative way, by the more mechanistic ontology that people implicitly have grown up with, make it all the more ridiculous to speak about theology and so on. And so I think kind of picking apart how we've shifted in our understanding of what a person is could be very helpful in that regard.
So this definition of what was it? Subsistent relation.
Yeah.
So like it just going off of that intuitively, what comes up for me is like, okay, so a relationship that subsists. So like a tornado does that for a little bit and then it dissipates. So like, am I understanding? Am I getting at the definition appropriately, or am I completely misunderstanding? Like some sort of relation that
maintains itself over time.
Right. Yeah.
I think so.
What is subsist? How does that differ from persist?
Yeah, I was just about to look it up, because normally I just kind of like, I'll see that definition and then I have my own kind of intuitive vague gestalt, and then I don't really analyze it further. An atom or group of atoms taking the place of another atom or group, or occupying a specified position in a molecule. Oh no, that's subsistent. Scratch that. Never mind. Subsist.
Subsistent.
Okay, well, now I'm seeing theology articles where by subsistent it means a reality that exists of itself.
Yeah, so
Because
maintain or support oneself.
yeah, since the three divine personal relations are identified with the divine essence, they are subsistent in themselves.
So
Right. So
okay, so
using
is there, like, I'm thinking of, I guess Pageau talks about like beings and hierarchies of reality is a hierarchy of beings that I guess the ones closer to God are more subsistent,
Hmm.
and then the ones further down are more uh what, fleeting or something like that.
Well, I
That's
think
kind
the
of what
second
came.
part he would say. And yeah, I'm still not sure about the definition of subsistent because here, at least in Aquinas, it seems like it's saying only God is subsistent. I don't know if there's even
Right,
degrees.
okay, yes. But the closer you are to God, the more
Yeah,
you participate in God, and therefore that's, you subsist insofar that you participate in the
yeah,
divine. Yeah.
and I think you could use John's language as well about having greater connectedness to others and yourself in reality in a consistent way, and then also reciprocal opening as simultaneously a movement like outward horizontally and upward ontologically. Uh, yeah, and then I was also going to say that maybe part of the issue is because of the propositional tyranny, we assume that like I was talking with this to Olivia recently that persons always have a moreness. Like everything always has a moreness, obviously, but persons have a more rich, like broad moreness compared to like a rock. But within the propositional tyranny of the culture, it's often assumed that like once you know about a person, then you've already kind of like figured them out, which probably contributes to a lot of like dating culture, not maintaining long term relationships,
Yeah.
and therefore assuming that image of a person once again gives the impression of a kind of static, very much non-inexhaustible image of God, which is a problem.
Right, right. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Which is why I'm very sympathetic to Pageau's more apophatic emphasis
Right.
on God as like outside the system. He's not a being. I find that super helpful for talking about like atheist or agnostic friends. And I think it's actually perfectly orthodox as well, small o within the tradition. And Paul Vanderklay has admitted that since, like, especially the Reformation, there was like I don't know if he said overemphasis. I would say overemphasis on the agent at the expense of the arena understanding of God, because of kind of the printing press obsession with propositions, which Protestantism was birthed through, the printing press revolution, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. I didn't follow the God one, God two conversation super closely when it was happening.
Oh, I
And
thought it was just terminology that Paul often uses. Like,
yeah, yeah, he does, but it sort of developed over a period of time, and I think it kind of changed definitions.
oh,
But
okay.
uh,
I
I
don't know
think
about the
I
change
think
either
no,
then.
I think you're using sort of where he's at. I think the way you're using it is where he's at right now, as far as I know. Um,
I think I was equating them with agent and arena. I don't know if you did that initially or
yeah,
over time.
I think that's a big aspect of it, at least. And so and it's really interesting. The agent, um, yeah, God being agent and arena, and then sort of that differentiates.
Which to me is like an explicit affirmation of panentheism, which is another term I love to use with people. So I find it's much more intelligible and less dualistic, and
Like the idea that God is in everything.
everything is in God, like it's both.
Hmm.
And there's especially in Eastern Orthodoxy, but even outside of it, there's more admission or like explicit affirmation of that as like perfectly fine language to use. Um, Even though it's a fairly recent term, like 1800s term, but theism, as like Paul Vanderklay was realized, is also a fairly recent term. It's like 1600s or something.
It's interesting that this is kind of I'm just um so something that I noticed is like, what is it? So this idea of God being in everything and everything being in God, and so it's that sort of interpenetration of God with everything. And I was like, okay, what's the what's the alternative to that? That would be God. God is in everything, so that's like the immanence of God. But then if it's not the other way around, then it's sort of there's something like I was trying to feel like what is it that feels wrong about that?
Which one?
Just feel like if you take away one of those aspects of panentheism,
Mm,
there's something that feels it's almost like an aesthetic sense, like
mm.
it's just not right or something like that.
Yeah, well, just thinking about it off the cuff, I suppose if you only had God is in everything, then in some sense you're kind of like dividing God into a bunch of little divine sparks or atoms, which can lead to a
Right.
kind of potential
Right, right.
narcissism where
Yeah,
everyone's like wanting to be their own Ubermensch.
right,
Alternatively, if you don't have that and you just say everything is in God, then it almost seems more like a pure arena where we're all in like a giant stomach or something.
right, right. Well, that's what I was gonna say. Like it, it's like if you put God in everything, it almost feels like the everything is more fundamental or something like that. But
Hmm.
I actually think the way you put it was better. Like, um, but it was interesting because I was noticing that it was a almost like an aesthetic judgment. That's how I was sort of judging it,
Hmm.
which was just I just noticed that was interesting. And but anyway, I okay. So agent and arena, God being agent and arena. Um, yeah, I'm getting there's something coming together here for me with it, which is um kind of like the continuity of well, okay, if we zoom in on because trying to get the continuity of agency in or personhood, and then how does that tie in with God? Like where's the continuity of that line?
Hmm.
And if we narrow in on life and matter, there's I want to get at the continuity of that. And like what is it that it's like something is not if you just have matter without life, there's not it's not subsisting in quite the same way. Like you have stable systems, but they're not seeking out their own
And seems
stability.
like they wouldn't be able to have a kind of internal relation. Like it would be purely extrinsic relation, like bumping into one another.
Right. Okay.
Which in one of the definitions of person, um, or even the subsistent relation, um, if you think of person or one that I added, person as a nexus of relationships, matter would only have those extrinsically, like at the physical level. But yeah, assuming you're not, I guess, well, I guess even if you are a kind of panpsychist, I guess you could say they have some degree of internal
I guess I'm
relationships,
not sure
but
what you mean by internal versus external relation. Because like if you think like a piece of like a rock, it has the relationships of the molecules that comprise the rock. Like what do you mean by internal relations?
oh, yeah, I guess I meant like mental or spiritual or qualia.
Okay, I see.
So life would add that. assuming you go for strong emergence over panpsychism.
Right. Right. Well, I don't, yeah, yeah, I don't see, okay, so yeah. Um, yeah, so that's interesting because okay, then again, yeah, that's a big it okay, so like phenomenology seems to be like what this is another thing I've been thinking about is when we talk about being as opposed to like when we're trying to get through the subject object divide and we're talking about being as sort of the transjective
Mm,
thing that unifies that.
hmm.
That to me is like maybe this is just I don't know Heidegger or something, but like that is a phenomenological reality that we're speaking of, like that transjective. Uh, but maybe I'm just equivocating the definition of phenomenology or something. But anyway, it's not that's not important. The transjective quality of being that 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 is another issue that goes along with this is um you can trace that down like I can see the continuous line all the way to the first life forms of like I'd imagine there's some sort of something that it is like
Hmm.
to be that system and then that I don't see how that continues past that point past
Lower.
into matter um
Well, it
although
wouldn't,
there's so this is where like Carl Friston comes into play where he's like he doesn't seem to actually make that big of a distinction theoretically in his theories between um, life and matter. He makes it basically his his like free energy principle covers basically everything down to like stable systems. So it would cover a rock, as I understand it. I could be wrong, but I was
but
talking to John about this, and he seemed like that was his understanding as well, and that was actually a critique of Friston is because he assumes like something like panpsychism, like you have to assume something like panpsychism because if you don't draw that line, then well, you have to assume something like panpsychism.
and does Friston do that explicitly?
I've never heard him talk about panpsychism. Like I've always heard him talk in much more like mathematical terms.
But does he indicate that he believes there's some kind of qualia that goes all the way down?
Well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would I think he would say that down to like single cell organism, like but beyond that, I don't know. And
Mm.
beyond that, he doesn't talk like he he really. It seems like he can like when he's thinking about his theory, the example that he's using is something like a single cell organism. But his theory also goes deeper than that to cover, like the oil drop in a cup of water. So the oil
Oh
drop
yeah,
is
maintaining its.
it's maintaining its structural functional organization, and in order to do that, it has to be enacting its environment. It has to have a model of its environment in the way that it's structurally functionally organized in
To
order to do
maintain the
that.
membrane. Yeah,
But but it's not.
but it wouldn't be a representational model, right? Or would he say that?
No, but it's it's a it's a it's a model, I guess. It's just that in the way that it's organized, it
Right.
necessarily has to be um yeah, not a representation, but like a um I don't even
like
know, I don't know what it is, but
enacted
yeah,
membrane structure.
it's something like that. In order to be coupled to its environment in a
Right.
stable way, it has to be have that sort of enacted model.
Yeah, this transition point is also something I've been interested in for quite a long time, and I'm still quite open to various suggestions on it. Even though for a while my perspective was basically a Whiteheadian one, which is pan-experientialism, just because the idea of qualia popping out of nowhere seemed implausible. So I guess I still took on John's sort of deep continuity language, but just within a framework of some kind of, asymptotically minute qualia with uh, a correlated tiny degrees of freedom for quarks or whatever. Because, but at the same time, Whitehead doesn't have a substance ontology, which kind of complicates most people's understanding of it. And he doesn't use the word panpsychism either, but he sees everything as prehending what it perceives, which is also a kind of relation. That every moment of experience is like every previous moment in the history of the universe goes into it to some various degree to form it, and then the eternal objects or the forms also structure it top down constraint wise. And then there's some tiny degree of free, or well, variously large degree of freedom depending on the complexity of the organism. Um, so he would see like a person as a community in some sense of the cells and the organs, etc. So there's no like atoms. It's like not atomistic at any level, um, but that droplets of experience and relationships are in some sense the equivalent to substances, and there's some degree of freedom for each moment that has all the past taken into it, concressing, and then the eternal objects structuring it, and then creativity, which is his ontological ultimate, um, provides some capacity for freedom. So there's like creativity, um, what's it called? Yeah, creativity essay or like as such, which is um, given, and then God's superjective lure, which is a kind of um, the most harmonious or integrative action that could be taken for that creature or that in that actual occasion, um, which it can go toward basically that God turns possibility into determinate freedom. So it's not just like pure chaos of possibility. Um, and in that sense, so I kind of had that ontology of Whitehead's, which solves the combination problem, which you might say is like a Deus Machina way, where God basically allows things to form larger gestalts or wholes. Because I remember on the last day before we left, when I was talking to John about uh yeah, panpsychism or pan-experientialism, he brought up the combination problem and as an issue for it. And that's kind of how I moved into any kind of theism in the first place. Was Whitehead's theology basically solves the combination problem through his theology in some sense, as the lure for greater complexity or complexification, maybe even in the sense that John talks about it, is more integration and more differentiation as something that is sort of calling forth for each actual occasion, dependent on the complexity of the previous community or creature or organism or whatever you want to call it. Um, that can make new wholes, but it's a weak emergence in the sense that there was always qualia throughout from the beginning. Um, and what you said about John saying that the fundamental reality is more like a tornado also reminded me of Whitehead's ultimate reality as creativity. Um, because in a similar sense, it's not like
Actually, I think what he said about the tornado, it wasn't, and I don't want to misquote him. I don't think it was about fundamental reality. I think he was talking about
Oh,
evolution.
oh, okay. Well, that makes more sense. Um,
I
well,
want to be careful. I don't want to misframe what he said. I think because he was talking to Lorcan about like evolution and teleology, and I think he was saying evolution is more like a tornado rather than an agent, something like that.
okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Um, well, that could still be applied to, and I would agree with that. Like it's searching out
But
new
evolution as a
affordances.
process, like that's pretty fundamental, you know, the evolution of the universe. It's like
Yeah,
that's
but I think there can still be, well, if you have any kind of classical theology where God's outside time, you can, I guess, still impose a kind of endpoint that it could arrive at through various ways, or you can have one where God either enters into time or is realizing himself in time, and therefore there's multiple possibilities to get to higher states of complexity. Um, but with Whitehead, creativity, like in some sense, I realize you can still kind of attribute as part of the infinite exploration, either of creatures or of God trying to realize new possibilities. Um, but regarding the jump from matter to life, you reminded me of another part of the conversation where Peterson was saying there's a bandwidth for consciousness, which is language Vervaeke also used with Pageau on principalities,
right.
where early on Peterson was saying like you know how to move your finger, but not how your finger moves. Like below that, you don't need consciousness. The question is whether the cells are conscious, but regardless, you have a bandwidth, and therefore it makes sense that above you, they're also, there's stuff that you're also not conscious of that is, more encompassing. Um, so I thought that was interesting. Similar to John's argument to Pageau on how you need tight feedback loops for consciousness to arise, or at least self-consciousness, um, and a specific bandwidth, and that principalities wouldn't have that, like a city wouldn't have the tight feedback loops. I know we were talking about this at the
Yeah, we
retreat
were
once.
talking about this. I just remembered that. Yeah. So I don't quite understand that argument. So even if what tight feedback loops, what's tight in like temporally tight? Like what's
I think so. Yeah, I think primarily that's what they mean.
so why is that absolute in nature, like that tight? Like
Well,
why
maybe it's
why is
not.
that absolute to all of reality and not relative to the system itself? Like
Yeah,
so
maybe it's not absolute. Like
a
if you get
city,
intimations
right, a
of,
city is functioning at maybe a slower time scale. Uh,
mhm.
and so maybe it has its that its bandwidth is just the consciousness happens over a longer time period or something like that. I don't know. I don't really understand. It feels weird to make that tight, the word tight and the tight feedback loop some sort of absolute, like it's got to be this many seconds or milliseconds or whatever. That doesn't
well,
really make sense to me.
I mean, you could also argue the other direction that there could be even more temporally quick feedback loops in the individual cells moving your finger that you're not aware of.
Right. Right. And so, yeah. And then that's another question is why aren't we aware? Let's say that our cells are conscious. Why are we not continuous with that? Or
Hmm.
it, like that's, and why is our consciousness not like it seems like the levels are, there's a discontinuity between the levels because it's like I'm perceiving from this level, like I'm conscious from this particular level and I'm not conscious below it or above it. Why is that?
I mean, in some sense, it's like evolutionarily pragmatic to reduce the combinatorial explosion. The question is whether you posit. I feel like in some sense it comes down to whether you like are an idealist or a panpsychist regarding whether you think there is consciousness above and below. It's at least to me, it seems like it's hard to speculate other than just what you think the fundamental nature is regarding, for example, idealism or panpsychism. Then you'll just, have a conclusion that follows from that premise, as opposed to maybe people having mystical experiences. I suppose maybe they could have a more empiricist intimation of the consciousness below in their body, like someone super mindful of their body, or um, in the contemplatio sense of above, like having a
Right,
sense of
right.
like the trajectory of history or something.
Well, that makes me think of Peterson has talked about like the shaman climb in sort of a religious experience climbing the cosmic tree
Mm.
where and did you listen to his conversation with Richard Dawkins? Because that
No,
was
I should because my cousin, who is like a huge Dawkins fan, who I've been trying to, bring up all these ideas with, I think he listened to it. I probably should so I can have a discussion with him about it.
yeah, it was interesting. Peterson very openly in that conversation confessed that he had taken 7 grams of mushrooms on 3 different occasions, and they were talking about Dawkins was Dawkins was bringing up the fact that Peterson had made the claim or had speculated that the um, the double helical serpent on the staff is sort of a representation of DNA or something. And it's a very, an ancient symbol and a recurring symbol throughout many cultures. And Dawkins is like pushing him on that. Like that couldn't possibly, that's absurd that you couldn't possibly be the case. And Peterson's response was like, well, one, I was sort of like speculating at the end of a lecture to sort of like, well, maybe. But also like I've had these experiences where I've, you know, it and he laid out sort of the shaman climbing up the consciousness can travel these different levels in sort of this altered state of consciousness. um and he claims that he went down into the at that he climbed down the level and actually saw the structure of DNA.
Hmm.
And Dawkins came back and was like, well, yeah, but the structure of DNA. And he's like, yeah, okay. um so it's I don't know, there's something to that idea of like consciousness can climb these different levels, um which is like self-evident by the fact that even the fact that scientifically we have gone down and studied the level of the cell. It's like at least on the
Well,
fact
yeah.
like on a time scale it can move down to that you know that level or travel up to this level. But then the
Well,
question,
of course, someone like Pageau would say that's an abstraction as opposed to experiencing the lower levels. Like it's a
yes,
symbol.
that's true. Yes. Yes, there's a difference there. Right.
Now, now I'm very curious if there are reports of people on like psychedelic trips or in mystical experiences where they have some sense of like, yeah, because it's always typically an ascent. I mean, maybe for good reason of or like in more meditative states, say where they're aware of. In some sense, I think skilled meditators can have a sense of like the different parts of their body, very with like a kind of richness, obviously. But is that
Yeah.
richness necessarily does that turn into I don't know a kind of experience of individual consciousness of the different cells? I don't know.
I don't know how that would work. Like I would imagine, I mean, I think about like the way that Vervaeke talks about meditation is you're breaking apart the gestalt into its features and
Hmm.
like paying attention to the individual sensations in your body.
Yeah.
Uh, but then and then contemplation would be going the other way and building up the well, you're simultaneously in meditation, you're also doing the um transparency opacity shift. So you're doing both of those in meditation as you're uh doing the transparency opacity shift at the same time that you're doing the breaking the gestalt into the features. And then in contemplation, you're doing the opposite, where uh you're stepping into the frame and putting the features into the larger gestalt.
Yeah.
Um,
And then in prajna, you do both simultaneously sometimes.
right, exactly, yes. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I'm like speculating here, but the question that's coming up for me is like I'm noticing I I have this need that something like qualia be like go down like there has to be continuity
Mm.
between qualia and not qual like it can't just be
Mm.
like that sort of strong emergence like
Yeah.
qualia shows up, it's like, well, where did it come from? But then
Yeah.
it's like but then I'm noticing like, and same thing for agency, like it's the same idea, like it can't just show up in reality, like whereas but then I'm also asking the question, okay, am I okay with that kind of strong emergence from with regard to other things? Because like I'm trying to think of an example of like what's something that's emergent, what's something that's truly emergent, like you don't
Like
see it.
artistic creation.
Right, right, but yeah, is that like,
Well, something like qualia just seems so fundamental to me. Like it's
well,
not
right,
really,
that's the idea, yeah.
it's not a gestalt. It's like it's a what Bernardo Castro calls it. It's one of the um it's part of the reduction base. Like you can't reduce any further than qualia. It's one of the irreducibles, which is why to me Vervaeke's deep continuity hypothesis has always felt a little like strained because I obviously want to say there is a deep continuity and gradation of complexity, but if you don't have some kind of pan experientialism, it just seems like the qualia pops out of nowhere, feels almost too strong of an emergence for me to feel plausible.
Right,
I don't know. It's always felt like that to me.
right. Well, I'm now wanting to go back and read or continue reading this thesis that I sent to John. Um, the Catherine Nave was critiquing Friston, um, and basically saying, no, there is a difference between just stable systems and living systems, and you have to
Mm,
account for that theoretically. Um, and now I'm wanting to, I sort of just got, you know, I wandered away from it. Now I'm wanting to go back and read it. Um, but I don't know. I find I'm kind of disagreeing with, or I want to disagree with John on if exactly what you just for yeah exactly what you just said. Because it's like it just seems like, but then I'm wondering again, why do I take issue? It's like it just shows up, and somehow that doesn't feel right. Like there's just a
yeah.
too sharp a discontinuity in reality or something, and there's got to
Yeah.
be it doesn't
For
feel
that.
full.
Like I'm actually more fine with strong emergence of agency and certainly artistic creation um, in comparison. They feel like qualitatively different classes than qualia as such
Right,
to me.
right,
I guess because agency is always like we were saying about the problem of evil early on, well, not the problem of evil, but the definition of evil. Agency to me is always, at least in our experience, uh, what do you call it? Like contingent or imperfect because of self-deception and addiction and so on. And in addition to ignorance and our finitude. Whereas qualia is like it seems kind of like an on or off switch. Even when you're
Right.
dreaming, I mean,
Right.
you're still experiencing qualia.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we should try to wrap this up. I notice we have less than a minute again
Oh,
now.
yeah.
Um,
Um, did you hear back from John? Did you send it through EMP? Did he respond through there,
no, I
the
sent it to him
paper?
during the retreat.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
So yeah, I just emailed him because we had been talking about it. So
Okay. Well,
uh,
I might be interested in that paper too. I still need to listen
I'll
to
send it to you.
Tristan's videos. I should do that first though.
All right. Well, this has been great. I would love to do it. Keep the conversation going. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, really helpful to have another person dialogue with,
Yeah, it was
not
great to see you
assuming.
again and talk to you again.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a good night. Let's do it again soon.